and no lawyer? You're really doing this alone? My brother said it slowly, savoring it, loud enough that the two clerks by the door turned to look. You're finished, Naomi. You just don't know it yet. The courtroom smelled like floor wax and old paper, that particular dryness public buildings have, the kind that sits at the back of your throat, somewhere a radiator ticked. I set a single accordion folder on the empty table in front of me and pulled out the chair. It scraped against the tile, and the sound carried. Across the aisle, Marcus had a lawyer in a $4,000 suit, a second-chair associate, and a wheeled crate of binders. He had our father's house keys in his pocket and our father's name in his mouth. I had a folder and a fountain pen. People do the math when they walk into a room like that. One side with a team, one side with nothing. They had already decided how the morning would end, and so had my brother, and so had the polished attorney beside him who would not look at me directly, the way you don't look directly at something you've already written off. What none of them knew was that I had spent 11 years of my life doing exactly one thing for a living, and that the document my brother had filed with the court that morning was going to end his attorney's career before lunch. My name is Naomi Hale. By the time you reach the end of this, the man in the $4,000 suit will have gone so pale that the judge stops the proceedings to ask if he needs a recess. And my brother will have learned that the quietest person in the room is almost never the weakest. But to understand how a woman with no lawyer walked into that courtroom and walked out with everything, you have to understand the family that taught me to stay quiet in the first place. I'm 44 years old. I live in Charleston, South Carolina, in a narrow house on a street where the live oaks lean over the road and drop acorns on the cars. I have a daughter, Grace, who is 8 and who believes she will one day own a horse, and I have a habit my whole family used to mock, which is that I write everything down. For 11 years, I was an assistant United States attorney. Financial fraud mostly. Public corruption. The kind of cases that are won or lost, not in dramatic speeches, but in spreadsheets, in the gap between what someone signed and where they actually were that day. I spent the better part of a decade taking apart the lies of men far more sophisticated than my brother. I was good at it. I was very good at it. You'd think a family would be proud of that. Mine never mentioned it. I grew up the second child, and the only daughter in a house where my brother Marcus was the son and the rest of us were weather. My father, Walter Hale, was a structural engineer, a man who could look at a bridge and tell you in 30 seconds whether it would hold, but who could look at his own daughter for 40 years and never once see what was actually there. Marcus was his future. Marcus was the name on the mailbox that mattered. I was the one who was expected to be fine, because I always was fine, because being fine was the only role available to me. Nobody ever said we love your brother more. They didn't have to. It came through in the arithmetic of a household. When Marcus failed a class, the school had failed him. When I brought home a near-perfect report card, my father would find the one grade that wasn't perfect and ask about that. When Marcus wrecked his second car at 19, my father co-signed the loan for the third. When I won a full scholarship to law school, my father said, well, somebody has to keep the lights on, and changed the subject to Marcus's new business idea. My mother loved me. I want to be fair to her. But she was a person who had spent 30 years managing my father's moods, and somewhere along the way, managing him had used up everything she had. When he was unfair to me, she would touch my arm under the table and say nothing, as if her silence were a kind of secret loyalty. By the time I was 15, I understood that her love and her courage were two different things, and I stopped waiting for the second one. I left for college, and then law school, and then a federal courthouse, and I built a life out of being the person nobody could rattle. I learned to keep my voice level when men twice my age tried to talk over me. I learned that the calmest person in a hearing is usually the one holding the strongest hand. And I learned to document everything. Every conversation, every promise, every dollar, not because I was suspicious by nature, but because in my work, the truth had a way of evaporating unless you nailed it to the floor. Marcus took a different road. He had charm the way some people have money, easily, carelessly, as if it would never run out. He started companies that lasted 18 months. He borrowed against things that weren't his. And every time the ground opened under him, my father was there with a check, a co-signature, a quiet transfer that my mother and I were not supposed to know about. I knew about all of them. I told you. I write everything down. Before I tell you what happened the morning my father changed his mind about me, and he did change it completely in the last 3 years of his life, Do me a small favor. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one, and I want to know who's here. Because this next part is the reason I'm telling this story at all. The first crack in the family I knew came on an ordinary Tuesday, when my father called me and didn't insult me. He was 76. He had been diagnosed 8 months earlier with Parkinson's, and the tremor had started to take his hands. The same hands that had drawn bridges for 40 years now shook too badly to sign his own name on a good day. My mother had passed 2 years before that, and Marcus, who lived 20 minutes from my father, somehow could never find the time. So I did what daughters in my position do all over this country, the ones nobody makes videos about. I rented out my place, I packed up Grace, and I moved home to take care of him. I want to be honest about something, because the master story everyone tells is that the good child does it out of pure love. It wasn't pure. I was furious underneath. I was 41 years old, and I had given up a courtroom I loved to spoon soup for a man who had spent my whole life looking past me. I did it anyway. I'm not sure I can fully explain why, except that I had spent my career making sure other people's records were complete, and I did not want the record of my own life to read that I had walked away from a dying parent, so I went. And here is the part that still undoes me a little. He saw me. Not all at once. It took months. But somewhere in those long afternoons, me reading the paper to him because his eyes had gone, him watching me handle the insurance company on the phone the way I used to handle a hostile witness, something in my father shifted. One evening, after I'd spent 40 minutes dismantling a fraudulent medical bill while he listened, he said quietly, "I never knew you could do that." "Do what?" I said. "All of it," he said. "Any of it." I didn't answer. I was 42, and my father had just told me, for the first time, that he'd been watching the wrong child his whole life. I went into the kitchen and ran the water so he wouldn't hear me cry. That was the only time I cried in those 3 years. I'm telling you because it's the only crack I'll show you, and I want you to know it was real, and then I want you to know I closed it and went back in and finished cleaning the kitchen. Over the next 2 years, my father and I built something that I think we both knew was an apology made out of time. He told me about my mother, about regrets, about the bridges he was proudest of, and on a cold February morning, his 81st birthday, I remember the pale gray light coming through the kitchen window and the smell of the cinnamon Grace insisted we put in everything. He asked me to call Frances Aldridge. Frances had been his estate attorney for 30 years. She was in her 80s herself by then, sharp as a tack, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a memory like a court reporter. My father had her come to the house. He had her bring a notary, and in front of 2 witnesses and a camera that Frances quietly set up on the kitchen counter, my father executed a new will. He left the bulk of his estate to me. He set up a protected educational trust for Grace. He left a specific, modest amount to Marcus. "Enough to remember me by, not enough to gamble away," he said, and Frances wrote it down almost word for word. And he left a bequest to the engineering scholarship fund at his old university. Then, on the recording, he looked into the camera and said, "Why?" He said he'd spent his life mistaking a loud child for a strong one. He said he was setting it right while he still could. He asked Frances to keep the recording, and he asked me to forgive him, and I said there was nothing to forgive, which was a lie we both let stand because it was kind. My father died 4 months later, in his sleep, on a Sunday. I was the one who found him. His face was peaceful. His hands, for the first time in years, were perfectly still. I thought the hardest part was over. I had no idea it hadn't started. 11 days. That's the detail that mattered, and I want you to hold on to it, because the whole case turns on it. We buried my father on a Thursday. The following Monday, Frances called me, and her voice had something in it I'd never heard from her, a kind of careful flatness, the voice of a professional choosing her words. "Naomi," she said, "Marcus has filed." "Filed what?" "A will," she said. "A different will. He's submitted it to the probate court as your father's true last testament. It's dated 3 weeks before Walter died. It leaves everything to Marcus." I sat down on the bottom stair of my father's house. Grace was at school. The hallway clock was ticking. I remember noticing the clock. "That's not possible," I said. "Dad signed his will in February. You were there. There's a recording." "I know," Frances said. I have the recording. But the document Marcus filed is dated April 3rd, and it's notarized. And his attorney has entered it as the operative will. Mancher and entries, entre enshar. April 3rd. I didn't gasp. I didn't cry. Something in me went very quiet and very clear, the way it used to go right before a cross-examination, when all the noise drops away and you can see the one loose thread. Francis, I said. On April 3rd, my father had been in the hospital for 6 days. He'd had a stroke on March 28th. It took the use of his right hand. He could not hold a pen. He could not have signed anything on April 3rd, let alone a 4-page legal document with a fluid signature. There was a pause on the line. Then someone, Francis said slowly, has a very large problem. I want to describe to you what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't rage, and the genre wants it to be rage. It was something colder and more useful. My brother had not simply tried to take money. Money I could have lived without. What Marcus had done was manufacture a piece of paper designed to erase the single most important thing that had ever happened between my father and me, the moment my father finally chose me. He was trying to forge over my father's apology. He was trying to make it so that, in the official record of our family, it had never happened. And of all the things you could do to me, that is the one I would never, ever let stand. I hung up the phone. I did not call my brother. I did not send an angry message. I went into my father's study, the one with the drafting table he never used anymore, and I took out a fresh legal pad, and at the top I wrote a single word. Document. Then I made a list, because that is what I do. Here's the thing my brother got wrong, and it's the same thing the favored child always gets wrong. He had spent his whole life watching our father underestimate me, and he had simply inherited the estimate. He looked at me and saw what Dad had always seen, the quiet one, the backup, the daughter who would absorb whatever was done to her because she always had. He did not see the 11 years. He did not see the federal grand juries, the forensic accountants I'd worked beside, the document examiners whose reports I'd built entire prosecutions around. He did not know that I could look at a signature and tell you whether the hand that made it was moving freely or copying a shape. He had no idea who he'd just challenged. And because he had a lawyer and I did not, he assumed the lawyer made him the dangerous one. I let him keep assuming it for 6 weeks. That was the first decision, and it was the most important one. The instinct, when someone forges your dead father's will, is to explode, to call them, to scream, to file something furious the same afternoon. I'd watched that instinct lose 100 cases. The forger wants you loud. A loud opponent reveals her hand and looks unstable in front of a judge. So I did the opposite. I let Marcus and his expensive attorney believe they were winning, and while they believed it, I quietly built the thing that would bury them. First, the medical records. I requested my father's complete hospital file from the stroke onward. Ever nair konsanna nair moin stans einneins. Every nurse's note, every chart, every neurological assessment. I knew what I was looking for, and I found it. A physician's note from April, first stating that the patient had no functional use of the right dominant hand, and a physical therapy assessment from April 2nd, describing his inability to grip a utensil. 2 independent medical professionals had documented, in real time, that on the days surrounding April 3rd, my father physically could not have signed his name. Second, the notary. The forged will bore a notary stamp and a name, a notary public named Dale Renner. I did what I'd done 1,000 times in my old job. I pulled the public record. Dale Renner's notary commission had expired in January. He had not been a commissioned notary on April 3rd at all. More than that, when I quietly tracked him down, I found a man who, it turned out, had done some bookkeeping for one of Marcus's failed companies. People who forge documents are almost never as careful as they think. They reuse the people they already own. Third, and this is the one that made the difference, the signature itself. I had a forensic document examiner I'd worked with for years, a woman named Dr. Priya Ven, who had testified in federal court more times than most lawyers have tried cases. I sent her 3 things: a clear scan of the signature on the forged April will, and 24 genuine signatures of my father's from across the previous decade, and the February will Francis had drafted. Dr. Ven called me 4 days later. "Naomi," she said, "I've done this for 26 years, and I rarely say things this cleanly. The April signature is not a signature. It's a tracing. Tell me how you know. Because it's perfect, she said. It is a millimeter for millimeter match to one specific genuine signature, a document your father signed in 2019. Real signatures vary. Nobody, not even the same person, signs their name identically twice. The pen speed, the pressure, the tiny tremors, they're always a little different. This one isn't a little different. It is identical to the 2019 exemplar, the way only a tracing can be. Whoever made this laid the 2019 signature underneath and drew over it. And there's lift and set hesitation in the line, the little pauses a tracer makes that a real writer never does. A tracing. My brother, or whoever he'd paid, had pulled an old document of my father's, slid it under a fresh page, and drawn my father's name over the top, copying the one moment his hand had been steady because his real hand never would be again. I thanked Dr. Venn. I asked her if she'd be willing to put it in a formal report and testify. She said she'd be honored. Then I sat in my father's study for a long time in the dark, because there's a particular kind of grief that comes when you finally hold proof of how little someone thought of you. And then I picked up the pen and kept working, because the proof wasn't the point. The point was to deliver it in a way no one in that courtroom would ever forget. Frances became my anchor, 83 years old, and she treated me not like a grieving daughter, but like a colleague, which was the kindest thing anyone did for me that year. She had the February will. She had the original execution video. My father, lucid, explaining himself, with the date visible on the morning paper she'd thoughtfully left on the table. She had her own notes and the two original witnesses, both of whom were alive and willing to testify. You know they think you have nothing, Frances told me one afternoon, over tea in her cluttered office, the radiator clanking. Marcus told the clerk you'd probably try to represent yourself. He thought it was funny. Good, I said. She looked at me over the beaded chain of her glasses. You're not going to hire counsel? No. Why not? I can give you 3 names who'd take this in a heartbeat. I thought about how to explain it. Because this isn't really about winning, Frances. If I hire a lawyer, then it's lawyers fighting, and Marcus tells himself he lost to a hired gun. I want him to lose to me. I want him to sit there and understand, in front of everyone, exactly who he spent his life looking past. The only way he learns that is if the person dismantling him is the sister he called the backup child. Frances was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Your father would have understood that perfectly. He had a structural mind. He'd have called it removing the load-bearing wall and letting the whole thing come down on its own weight. That's exactly what it is, I said. There was one more thing I prepared, and I almost didn't, because it felt like too much. But in my old job, I'd learned that you always bring the thing you hope you won't need. I drew up, in proper form, a referral package, the kind of document a prosecutor sends when a matter should go from a civil court to a criminal one. Forging a will is not a family squabble. It's a felony. Submitting a forged instrument to a court is fraud upon the court. I didn't want to use it, but I built it, clean and complete, and I put it in a separate folder, and I told no one it existed. Quick word, because we're about to walk into that courtroom together. If you want to see exactly what happened when the judge picked up that final folder, and what my brother's attorney did when he finally understood what he was holding, make sure you've hit subscribe right now, because what comes next is the whole reason I'm telling you any of this. The hearing was set for a Monday in October. The night before, I laid out my father's fountain pen on the desk, the heavy black one he'd drawn bridges with, the one I'd watched his ruined hand fail to hold, and I sat with it for a while. Then I packed my single accordion folder. Not because I only had one folder's worth of evidence. I had boxes. I brought one folder into the room on purpose. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can carry is the appearance of having almost nothing. The courtroom was fuller than a probate hearing has any right to be. Word travels in families. A cousin I hadn't seen in a decade was in the 3rd row. 2 of my father's old colleagues sat near the back. Marcus's wife, Danielle, sat directly behind him in a navy dress, her hands folded like a woman at church, and I knew the second I saw her face that she had been in on it from the beginning. And in the 2nd row, where she absolutely did not want to be, sat my niece Hannah, Marcus's 16-year-old daughter, looking like she'd rather be anywhere on earth. I counted 31 people in that room. not including the staff. I'm telling you the number, because the number is the point. Marcus had chosen to do this in public. He would learn what public means. Judge Adele Calloway took the bench at 9 sharp. She was a small, precise woman with silver hair and the unhurried manner of someone who has watched people lie to her for 30 years and is no longer impressed by any of it. The bailiff called the room to order. We all stood. We all sat. Marcus's attorney rose first. Preston Vance. He was good. I'll give him that, and I knew within 5 minutes that he was good, which made what happened later land all the harder. He had a smooth, reasonable voice, the kind that makes a courtroom relax. He laid out his client's position, like a man laying a table for a dinner he was certain would go well. Your Honor, he said, this is a sad but simple matter. Walter Hale executed a final will dated April 3rd of this year, leaving his estate to his son, Marcus. That will is properly notarized and witnessed. The respondent, Ms. Hale, he gestured at me without looking at me, seeks to set it aside in favor of an earlier February document, executed at a time when, frankly, Ms. Hale had unsupervised daily access to her ailing father and every opportunity to influence him. We will show that the April will reflect Mr. Hale's true and final wishes, made after reflection, restoring his estate to its natural heir. His natural heir. I wrote those 2 words down. Vance sat. Marcus leaned back with the satisfaction of a man watching a movie he's already seen. And then, because he couldn't help himself, he turned halfway around toward me and said it again, lower this time, just for me, the same words he'd said when I walked in. No lawyer, he murmured, shaking his head almost gently. You're finished. I looked at him for a long moment, then I turned to the bench. Your Honor, I said, may I respond? You may, Ms. Hale. I stood. I left the folder on the table. I walked to the podium with nothing in my hands, and I felt 31 people lean forward because nothing makes a room nervous like a person who has decided not to be. Mr. Vance is right about one thing, I said. This is a simple matter. He's simply wrong about which fact makes it simple. I let that sit. The document my brother filed is dated April 3rd. So I'd like to begin not with my father's wishes and not with anyone's character, but with a single physical question. On April 3rd, was Walter Hale capable of signing his name? I asked the court's permission to enter my first exhibit. Judge Calloway nodded. This is my father's complete hospital record, I said, handing certified copies to the bailiff, to the clerk, and to Mr. Vance, who took his with the mild patience of a man humoring an amateur. My father suffered a stroke on March 28th. I direct the court to the physician's note dated April 1st. Endres Dunsterns allen Mines Tons Trenschalp, I read it aloud, slowly. No functional use of the right dominant hand. And the physical therapy assessment dated April 2nd, patient, unable to grip a standard utensil. I looked up. 2 medical professionals, independently, in the ordinary course of treating my father, documented that in the days surrounding April 3rd, his signing hand did not work. He could not have produced the signature on the will my brother filed. Not a shaky version of it. Not any version of it. Naster and Saulans Constervernaninso. The room had gone still in the particular way rooms go still when the floor shifts. I saw Mr. Vance stop humoring me. He picked up the hospital record and actually read it. That alone, I continued, ends the question of whether my father signed that document. But I understand the court will want to know what the signature is, if it isn't his. So I'd like to call Dr. Priya Ven. I watched Vance's head turn toward me, and I watched the name register, because a man who practices in this state and does not know the name Priya Ven is a man who does not read his own field. He knew exactly who she was. The patience left his face. Dr. Ven took the stand. She was unflappable, professional, devastating. She walked the court through the genuine signatures, the variation present in all of them, the natural tremor of a man with Parkinson's, the living quality of a real hand. And then she put up the April signature beside the 2019 exemplar, and even from the gallery you could hear the intake of breath because anyone could see it. They are identical, Dr. Ven said. Not similar. Identical. to the millimeter. In 26 years, I have never seen two genuine signatures match this way because it is not possible. A human hand cannot reproduce itself. What the court is looking at is a tracing, the 2019 signature placed beneath this page and drawn over. You can see the lift and set hesitation marks here and here and here. Dr. Stand, she pointed. The small pauses a person makes when copying a shape rather than writing a name. Dr. Venn, I said, to be clear, in your professional opinion, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, is the signature on the April 3rd will genuine? It is not, she said. It is a forgery. A traced forgery. I let the silence work. I had learned long ago not to fill it. Across the aisle, Marcus had stopped leaning back. Danielle had stopped looking like a woman at church. Thank you, Dr. Venn, I said. I have one more exhibit, and then I have a question for opposing counsel. I entered the notary record next, the certified state record showing that Dale Renner's commission had expired in January, that he had no authority to notarize anything on April 3rd, and a quiet little document showing Mr. Renner had done bookkeeping for one of my brother's companies. I watched the picture assemble itself in the judge's eyes, a forged signature, an invalid notary, a notary connected to the man who benefited. I didn't have to draw the line between the dots. Judge Calloway had been drawing those lines since before I was admitted to the bar. Then I turned to Preston Vance. Mr. Vance, I said, I'd ask you to look at the original of the April 3rd will, the one your clients gave you. Not the copy. The original, which I believe is in your binder. Source, Wenster and Danor and He hesitated. A lawyer learns to feel a trap closing. But there was no way to refuse without looking like he had something to hide. So he opened his binder and took out the original document, and he looked at it, really looked at it, perhaps for the first time as something other than his client's truth. And now, with Dr. Venn's testimony in his ears and the hospital records in his hand, I watched it happen. I will remember it for the rest of my life. The color left his face, not slowly, all at once, the way it does when the blood actually drops, when a man's body understands something a half second before his mind catches up. He went gray. His hand, holding the page, lowered to the table as if it had become too heavy. Because Preston Vance was not a forger. Preston Vance was a competent attorney who had been handed a document by his own clients and told it was real, and who had stood up in front of a judge and certified it as genuine, and who now understood, in a single sickening instant, that he had presented a forged instrument to a court, that his clients had used him. That his name, his license, his 30 years were attached to a fraud. Judge Calloway saw it too. She set down her pen. Mr. Vance, she said. Do you need a moment? He didn't answer right away. He was staring at the page. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost everything that had made it smooth. Your Honor, he said, I would request a brief recess to confer with my clients. I'm sure you would, the judge said dryly. Take 10 minutes. I won't pretend I know exactly what was said in the hallway during those 10 minutes, but I know that Preston Vance came back into that courtroom a different man, and I know that he sat as far from Marcus as the table allowed, and I know that when the judge resumed, he stood and said the words that no client ever wants to hear from his own attorney. Your Honor, I am withdrawing as counsel in this matter, effective immediately, and I will be filing the appropriate notice with the court. A lawyer does not abandon a paying client in the middle of a hearing for a small reason. Everyone in that room knew what it meant. He was getting his name off the fraud before it touched him. He was, in his own way, fleeing. Marcus turned to him, panicked. You can't. I have no further statements, Vance said, and he gathered his binder, and he did not look at my brother again. And now, my brother sat at a table with no lawyer. The irony was not lost on the gallery. I heard it move through the room, the soft sound of 30 people understanding something at once. No lawyer. You're finished. He had said it to me twice. Now it was true, and it was true of him. Judge Calloway folded her hands. Mr. Hale, she said, you may of course seek new counsel, but I'd remind you that the evidence before me is substantial. Before I rule, is there anything you wish to say? Marcus stood. For the first time in our entire lives, my brother did not know what to do with a room. The charm had nowhere to land. He looked at me. actually looked at me, the way you look at a stranger who turns out to know your name. And I watched him reach for the old script, the one that had always worked. Naomi, he said. Come on, this is family. We can settle this. We don't need to. We're not in family anymore, Marcus, I said quietly. We're in court. You brought us here. You manipulated him, he tried, swinging back to the old accusation, but his voice had no floor under it. You were with him every day. I was with him every day, I said, because you weren't. You were 20 minutes away for 3 years and you couldn't find the time. I gave up my career and moved my daughter into his house and learned how to crush his pills into applesauce because his hands shook too badly to hold a spoon. The same hands you say signed a 4-page will 11 days before he died. I let that land. You didn't lose Dad's estate today, Marcus. You lost Dad years ago. Every Sunday you didn't call. You just never noticed, because you assumed I'd always be standing between you and the consequences. I'm not standing there anymore. And I stein, bye-bye my Sunday. He had no answer. There is no answer to the truth when it is said quietly. Judge Calloway looked down at the bench, at the hospital records, and the notary file and Dr. Venn's report, and then she delivered her ruling in the flat, final voice of someone who has seen the whole arc of it. The court finds the document submitted as the decedent's will dated April 3rd to be invalid. The medical evidence establishes the decedent was physically incapable of executing it. The forensic evidence establishes the signature to be a forgery. The notarization is void on its face. She looked up. The February will, properly executed and corroborated by contemporaneous video record, is admitted as the valid and final last will and testament of Walter Hale. The petition to set it aside is denied in its entirety, and the petitioner will bear the costs of this action. She wasn't finished. Furthermore, she said, the court does not take the submission of a forged instrument lightly. Ms. Hale, I understand you have prepared materials regarding referral of this matter. The court will receive them. This was the folder I had hoped not to use. I stood and I walked to the bench and I handed up the clean, complete referral package, the one I'd built and told no one about. I handed a copy to the clerk for the record, and I watched my brother finally understand that the worst thing that happened to him that day was not losing the money. It was that the sister he'd called finished had spent 11 years learning exactly how to make sure he wasn't. I did not gloat. I want you to know that. I felt no rush of triumph when the judge spoke, and I want to be honest about why, because the genre wants me to feel victorious, and I mostly felt tired. Marcus was still my brother. Hannah, my niece, was sitting in the second row watching her father come apart, and she had done nothing to deserve a single moment of it. There is no version of this where a family wins. There is only the version where the truth is allowed to stand, and the version where it isn't. I had simply made sure it was allowed to stand. I gathered my one folder. I had never opened it. I'd known I wouldn't. 6 months later, I'm writing this from the kitchen of my father's house, which is my house now, with the same gray February light coming through the window because the year has come back around to where it started. Marcus did not go to prison. I want to tell you the truth instead of the satisfying ending. The matter was referred, and the referral did its work. He was charged, and his attorney, a new one, who insisted on cash up front, negotiated a plea. He pleaded to attempted fraud. He received probation, a felony on his record, and an order to pay restitution and the costs of the case. The felony cost him more than any sentence would have. A man whose entire life was built on charm and on people's willingness to trust him discovered that a fraud conviction follows you into every room you ever try to charm your way into again. Danielle, who had helped him from the beginning, filed for divorce within the year. Not out of conscience, I think, but because the well had finally run dry, and she had only ever been standing where the money was. Dale Renner, the false notary, lost the right to ever hold a commission again and is dealing with his own consequences. I used my father's estate the way he asked me to. Grace's trust is untouchable now, sitting quietly until she's grown. And yes, there will be a horse eventually, because life is short and my daughter is going to know what it feels like to have someone keep a promise. I endowed the engineering scholarship my father wanted, in his name, at his old university, and the first recipient, a young woman from a small town who is the first in her family to go to college, sent me a handwritten letter that I keep in the drawer of my father's drafting table, next to his fountain pen. And there is one more thing. My niece, Hannah, called me about a month after the hearing. She was 17 by then, terrified, calling from her bedroom in a low voice. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't known what her father was doing, and I believed her because she was 16 when it happened, and children are not responsible for their parents' choices. She said she didn't have anyone to talk to about college, about what she wanted to do with her life, and that she'd remembered I was a lawyer. I told her she could call me any time. I meant it. She comes to Charleston now, sometimes, on the bus, and we sit at this kitchen table and I help her with her applications, and she tells me about the law schools she's looking at because, and this still makes me smile, she's decided she wants to do what I used to do. The favored son's daughter, learning to take apart lies for a living, taught by the daughter nobody favored. My father, the structural engineer, would have appreciated the symmetry. The load found its way to the part of the family strong enough to carry it. I never reconciled with Marcus. I want to be clear about that, because reconciliation is the lie these stories usually end on. The door is not open. Some doors shouldn't be, and pretending otherwise isn't forgiveness. It's just letting someone hurt you again on a slower schedule. But I forgave him, which is a different thing entirely. I forgave him the way you set down something heavy you've been carrying for so long you forgot it had weight. I didn't set it down for him. I set it down for me. Here is the thing I understand now, that I didn't understand sitting alone behind my father's house as a girl, measured my whole life with the wrong ruler. The people who decide you are weak are not measuring your strength. They are measuring their own comfort. My brother needed me to be the quiet one, the backup, the daughter who absorbed things, because a world where I was capable was a world where his failures were actually his own. My silence wasn't weakness. It was the room I gave other people to be wrong about me in, right up until the day I decided to stop giving it. You do not have to announce your strength to have it. You do not have to win the argument in the kitchen to win the war that actually matters. Sometimes the most powerful thing in any room is the person everyone has already decided is finished, quietly opening a folder. If you've ever been the one your family looked past, the strong one who was never allowed to need anything, the one expected to absorb whatever was handed to you, I want you to hear this from someone who spent 40 years on the other side of that ruler. You were never the backup. You were never finished. You were just patient. And patience, when it finally decides to move, is the most dangerous thing there is. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to believe in you the most? What did it teach you? I read every one, and I want to know where you're standing right now. And if stories about quiet strength and earned justice mean something to you, subscribe and stay with me, because there's another one coming, and I'd like you here when it does. Thank you for sitting with me through this. My grandfather used to... No, that was someone else's story. My father used to say that any structure will tell you the truth about itself the moment you put real weight on it. He was right. He just never expected to be the one who learned it.